This Bug Delver deck, in addition to Abrupt Decay, has mostly just black for discard, like Hymn to Turok, and blue for permission, like Force of Will and Daze, as well as all the usual cantrips. He is very much the beatdown deck with Tarmogoyf, Delver's Secrets, and Tombstalker.
So Joe leads off the action with a basic island and a Sensei's Divining Top. Daniel with an Underground Sea and a Deathrite Shaman.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to see this whole Abrupt Decay versus Counterbalance matchup. You know, Counterbalance had dominated Legacy a few years ago. It largely fell by the wayside with the advent of Abrupt Decay, but in recent months has been making a comeback. I mean, this Miracles deck did very, very well at the, this style of Miracles deck did very well at the Grand Prix in Paris not a month ago.
As you see Joe here brainstorming his main phase after playing a fetch land. You know, the big thing for me is, I think what really separates the pilots of this deck is the speed with which they play. You know, at Grand Prix Columbus a few years back when Counterbalance was all over the place, there were so many unintentional draws. And usually when the Miracles player has an unintentional draw, it's a game they would have otherwise won with more time. So playing the deck with sufficient speed separates draws from wins, and that's a huge part of the performance. So you see Joe not ready to break his fetch land just yet because of this opposing Deathrite Shaman. Daniel untaps and takes the second turn.
Deathrite Shaman, a very, very powerful tool in Legacy. Functioning as a, I mean, even though he has green mana, often it is being powered off of black mana, being a bird of paradise, but it also is a much faster clock than usual, and a form of disruption against Snapcaster Mage, and a backup way to gain some life, and an anti-combo card.
Yeah, it's, you know,
that is a lot for a 1-drop.
It does quite a bit in this format, and, you know, it's a big part of the reason that, you know, decks like Reanimator and Dredge are not nearly as prevalent as they used to be. One of the best sideboard cards in the format against you is actually a card people have 4 copies of game 1. As you see, Daniel will attempt to resolve Hymn to Torak.
It's always an interesting dance, Force of Will versus Hymn to Torak, as you're still down 2 cards, but at least you get to pick it.
Yeah.
The downside, of course, being that one of the 2 you have to pick is Force of Will.
But Force of Will's value also goes down a lot once you've been hymned, and so
definitely.
I believe it is often correct to be Force of Willing hymns.
Yeah, particularly in a spot where it's not like he has the win on the board and he just needs to protect it. I mean, the time you don't Force of Will the Hymn to Torak is when you're just riding out the 1 permanent that you just need to protect at all costs.
All right, so Joe does decide to use his Force of Will here, pitches Counterbalance. And Daniel, I believe, passes the turn.
Now, this is a primarily, you know, straightforward Miracles deck. Some of his twists, though, include he does have main deck Red Blast and Pyroblast.
Yeah, Joe does a lot of brewing with this deck, and I've covered him for years now playing in Legacy. I've seen, you know, moats in the sideboard. I played against Joe in a Legacy Open in Los Angeles a few years ago. He killed me with Baneslayer Angel. I mean, this guy goes deep on this deck.
Well, sure. Anybody with basic, you know, with revised islands, you know that's a statement of where they're at mentally.
Right.
And he even has 1 misdirection instead of the 4th Force of Will. What do you think about that?
You know, you get to look at a lot of cards with Divining Top, and there's huge upside to having a misdirection. Sometimes misdirection is dramatically better than Force of Will.
What's kind of wild is having a 2nd misdirection in the sideboard and no Force of Wills in the board.
Yeah. See Daniel here attempt to resolve a Tarmogoyf after Joe simply played a land on his turn and passed. See if this prompts any sort of response from Joe, who has a hand of Dividing Top, Venser, and Vendilion Click.
And he blows the top in order to get to a counterspell.
And Daniel says that resolves.
The top making its triumphant return. I don't think there's any card in Magic that more embodies the Eric Lauer experience than Sensei's Divining Top.
For our audience who's not familiar, as you see Joe, again, use the Divining Top to draw, what would you say is the Eric Lauer experience?
The Eric Lauer experience is spending a bunch of time and just manipulating resources in order to gain tiny edges, micro edges, where It's not. It's just a bunch of work you have to do because it's strictly better, but it's just you're not even really doing anything. You're just manipulating. You're just, like activating Sensei's Divining Top is you keep rearranging your deck, you keep looking at things, you keep putting the top on top of your deck, you keep recasting the top. You have to do so many operations in order to get these little edges. It's like thinning your deck. If you're thawing glaciering every turn, it takes a long time because you have to shuffle your deck every single turn. But you're getting tiny little edges because your increased probability of, like, even when you have more land than you could ever need, you still keep thawing because it increases the probability you'll draw spells by a couple %.
Yeah.
That is the Eric Lauer experience. Not that he's a fan of it, but because he invented the terminology to realize this happens and to design cards in the future that avoid this.
Joe has added a mountain, so he's revealed his third color in his deck here. Daniel simply plays a land and passes.
See, once a guy's got basic mountain, basic plains, and basic island, and they're all from Revised, this is the spot where I start expecting him to just drop a basic forest and just start domaining it up.
See, Daniel activate Deathrite Shaman at the end of the turn, going after Joe's spells in graveyard.
These bug decks are some of the highest quality cards. It's sort of like they're the Jund of Legacy, where it's just a bunch of really quality cards,
Yeah.
Not even like any inherent game plan, just sort of I'm going to play the best creatures there are, I'm going to play the best spells there are, and I'm just going to kind of, deal with whatever comes along.
Yeah, the only card that sort of reveals anything is really going on specifically at all in Daniel's list is 2 copies of Tombstalker in the main deck, which is really easy for him to facilitate. Lots of spells, of course, fetch lands, turn this on, and a reasonable threat against Joe as well as, of course, well outside of counterbalance range.
What are your thoughts on the difference between these style of bug decks versus the shardless agent bug decks with Ancestral Visions and cascading into Hymn to Tarax?
I like the type of version that Daniel is playing quite a bit more, as you see him crack a fetch land here. Just because I think the shardless ancestral build of the deck has to make too many concessions in deck building to play shardless agent, and also has a pretty rough combo matchup game 1.
That's fair.
So I think it's also a legitimate deck, but I prefer the kind of the disruption overload, nothing too fancy build that Daniel's playing.
No Thoughtseize is anywhere in a 75 though, is a little bit wild.
Well, Thoughtseize versus him in this deck is definitely a contentious issue. I'm personally in the Thoughtseize camp myself. The 2 cards do different work in different matchups. As you see Joe here, spin the top at the end of the turn. I err towards wanting Thoughtseizes as a concession to the mana base and the combo matchup as well.
What I want to know is where them true name nemesis at?
The metagame that has adapted. We should talk about that after the match. I think that's a big story here. Joe attempting to resolve Vendilion Click at the end of Daniel's turn, which resolves. Daniel reveals a very land-heavy hand here. 2 lands in hand on top of the 5 that he already has in play, a Tombstalker and a Daze.
Now, there's a pretty good chance he's going to take that Tombstalker, right?
Well, here's the thing that complicates this. Joe has access to Venser in his hand, which is a pretty good answer to Tombstalker.
That's true.
And Joe says, yeah, you keep him. At this point, I think Joe is much more worried about Daniel finding a removal spell for a Vendilion Click than he is about the threats in hand.
The 1 Venser and 3 Vendilion Clicks in Joe's deck going a long way in conjunction with the 2 copies of Caracas he plays.
Yeah. Oh, I've watched Joe Venser Caracas people out of games. I've seen a lot of angles from Joe over the years. So, Joe stopping Daniel inside of upkeep. Tops, has Entreat the Angels on top of his deck, and he's going to be able to resolve a pretty big Entreat here.
This does mean he's going to lose his top, though.
Yeah, but I think that's, given the softness of Daniel's hand, I think he's willing to give it up.
Small price to pay for 12 power worth of Angels.
So you see.
Oh, he only does it for 2, though, because of the days, of course.
Yes. But 2/4/4 still mighty good here. It resolves, and Joe Always the faithful servant of miracles actually has the angel tokens at the ready.
Indubitably.
And
Now,
then
what's Daniel have to get out of this? How does he beat 2 more angels?
Given how badly he's flooding out, it's unlikely he can. He would have to brainstorm into multiple pieces of action. It's possible, on the surface, the Tombstalker answers this, but we know that this is a challenging path because of the Venser that Joe has access to.
Yeah, I mean, this looks like a good answer, but it just plays right into Joe's plan.
Yeah, which is actually often the Joe Lossett experience. It looks good, but you are simply playing into the other out he's already sculpted. And here you see Venser show up. And 11 points in the air. And this really escalated quickly. Joe went from 0 to 60 in this game really fast.
Yeah.
And there's a concession, a very flooded out Daniel Baker, unable to overcome Joe Lossett's Angels and Vendilion Click for a fast game 1.
Now, what does he have in the board?
Well, Daniel has a Grafdigger's Cage, a Sylvan Library, a Maelstrom Pulse, a Submerge, a Vendilion Click, a Crozan Grip, a Liliana the Veil, 2 Golgari Charms, 3 Spell Pierces, and 3 Disfigures. I think that he just sort of wants the types, just high impact cards that are good in slow attrition-oriented games. So the Sylvan Library I like a ton. I really like the Liliana the Veil. I think the Vendilion Click is going to come in. I think it's reasonable actually for the Maelstrom Pulse to come in as well, because I think these tempo cards are not necessarily at their best. I think, in the control matchups, I think the tempo cards are still good post-board, assuming that your opponent is susceptible to Wasteland. That's a real plan that you can sculpt. When your opponent is largely immune, like Joe is, then I think it's really hard to play, the Daze Spell Pierce, get a guy into play sort of game plan that Delver decks traditionally like to play.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I got to imagine the Dazes are going out. It'll be interesting to see how he feels about Spell Pierce, because there's a lot of great targets, a lot of good early battles. It could be really, really good, but it might just be that he wants to slow it down and not worry about any of the tempo plays at all.
What's Joe got access to? Some awesome stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. The first of all, Red Elemental Blasts and Pyroblast, that kind of stuff, he'll want more of it. I mean, it's not at its best here, but it's not just that it counters Brainstorm and Force of Will. It kills a Delver, which is often an important play. Beyond that, Rest in Peace is an interesting one. Rest in Peace, first of all, obviously shutting off Tarmogoyf and Deathrite Shaman, which is pretty huge, but also completely taking the legs out from under a Tombstalker.
Yeah, I really like it a lot in this matchup.
Yeah, I think it's going to be real good for him. Plus, you never know. Some of these bug players will occasionally have something like a Life from the Loam or something. And then finally, he's got a variety of just miscellaneous options depending on how he wants to play it. Things like, I mean, I don't personally like Celestial Purge, but it is an option to consider because it hits Deathrite Shaman and Tombstalker, as well as the Lilianas that he doesn't know about, but he is aware are a possibility.
Yeah, a lot of this is sculpting, right? Like, you're looking at your list, you're seeing what's inefficient. A lot of these cards, like the Celestial Purge you just mentioned, is okay. It could come in or could not, depending on if you have cards that are just better or worse. It sounds simple to put it that way, but a lot of it just depends on what does my 60 cards look like? What are the cards I'm cutting and what am I leaving in? Do I like, the Red Elemental Blast and the Pyroblast and the Spell Pierce in my deck better than the Celestial Purge, or do I think I get more value out of that?
Now, I don't like Force of Will generally against these Hymn to Turok decks. I could actually even see cutting all the Force of Wills, maybe keep one, but probably cut all the Force of Wills. And what I would like to see is a second Misdirection in the deck, because he doesn't know that you have them. He doesn't know that that's what you're capable of. Then you could just Force a Will, you could Misdirection his Hymn to Turok and devastate him. Plus, you're occasionally going to do things like Misdirect and Abrupt Decay to kill a Tarmogoyf. So I think Misdirection could be a real hot transition here that Daniel would not expect. And certainly, nobody expects the second Misdirection.
Yeah, the big question mark that I have here, from Joe's side of the matchup is, are you still trying to establish counterbalance lock? Or in the face of Abrupt Decay, you say, forget that, I'm going to remove the counterbalances, some of the permission like Force of Wills, and become, a more proactive removal style deck? Or is counterbalance still valid, in spite of Abrupt Decay, and do I try to sculpt my game plan around that? I think that's the big question mark.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because you can't count on the counterbalance in this matchup, but my goodness, is it the best thing he's got going on beyond, beyond setting up Miracle in treats and Terminus.
But I think that game plan, that second game plan you just described, actually is very good for Joe.
Oh, yeah.
It's Daniel doesn't have Pernicious Deed or any sort of sweeper, so Entreat is enormous, and he has to get multiple creatures in play, most likely to apply sufficient pressure to overwhelm plows and just to give Joe not enough time. So the Terminus plan is really good too. I think my instinct, if I was Joe, would be I'm not playing counterbalance, and I'm just playing good 1-for-1s and trying to win the game with Terminus and Entreat. That would be my way of approaching the matchup. But we shall see. Joe is the expert here by a country mile.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I reckon the last time I played Legacy at the Pro Tour, it was with counterbalance top, and it was good.
Turn 1 Tropical from Daniel, Scalding Tarn from Joe for a Catacomb. And Joe's got to be really thrilled with this opening.
No pressure.
Yeah, just...
I mean, the game going longer favors him by a lot.
Yeah.
It's not even just the miracles. I mean, Jace the Mind Sculptor and Sensei's Divining Top are very powerful for prolonged games.
Even, even the random Fencers and stuff like that. I mean, he's got a lot of tools that are really awesome at playing long games. And Daniel, not so much. Much more incumbent on him to get the ball rolling here. And you did see a Spell Pierce in his hand, so he did go to that well. Daniel plays a Wasteland and attempts to resolve Tarmogoyf.
Is this the showdown?
Well, this is going to prompt some sort of response from Joe, I'm sure. He does have Rest in Peace in hand, so there's no huge rush to do anything about this Tarmogoyf.
But man, he would like to fight on Daniel's turn so that he can untap and just do whatever he wants.
Joe contemplating whether or not he wants to brainstorm here. Asks for cards in hand. And Joe's going to try to resolve a brainstorm.
Any chance we see a Spell Pierce? We do not.
In general, I'm a fan of just spell-piercing brainstorms unless there's really strong evidence not to do so. But I can also appreciate trying to save it for something high impact when you have no information about what Joe's hand is like.
A lot of great options available to Joe.
Oh, yeah. He's even found a Flooded Strand, which allows him to fetch a Plains and not worry about this Wasteland. I mean,
yeah. I mean, this looks like everything is going according to plan for Joe. I got to think he's a pretty good favorite right now. Daniel has his work cut out for him, but he does have the ability to access cards pretty rapidly between Brainstorm and Ponder.
And Daniel passes it back, has Ponder in hand, elects not to cast it, holding up that Spell Pierce. Joe uses his Scalding Tarn to find a mountain. Which is critical for the red Elemental Blast he has access to in his hand. And Joe draws a Tundra.
I love all this basic fetching by Joe, very experienced Legacy player. He knows the Song and Dance. He knows that this bug deck is so good at crippling you with Wasteland if you let it.
And you very rarely see 3 different basic lands on one side of the table in Legacy. 2 here and there, 3 very uncommon. Joe tries to land Rest in Peace. Daniel fights over this with Spell Pierce. Joe uses a red Elemental Blast. Rest in Peace in play, and This is, you know, one part of the sleeper hold starting to get applied. Joe is just trying to slowly cut off the angles of attack that Daniel has access to. And there is a Golgari charm.
So is that Rest in Peace in the graveyard or not? And is the Golgari charm in the graveyard or not?
I believe one of them is exiled and one of them is not.
Yeah, but is that actually the correct ones? Because it seems like the Golgari charm, my guess is actually that they're both supposed to be in the graveyard. We should probably make sure that the people on the floor have things lined up correctly.
No, I think Rest in Peace is exiled and the Golgari charm goes to the graveyard.
It's one of those Lightning Bolt Doomblade situations, right?
Yeah, I think so. So you're seeing a Terminus from Joe here inside of this.
Yeah, for those not familiar, the Lightning Bolt Doomblade situation is that when you Lightning Bolt a Dryad Militant, the Lightning Bolt is exiled, but if you Doomblade a Dryad Militant, the Doomblade is not exiled.
Right, because the damage is part of a state-based trigger thing versus the text on the card saying simply destroy it.
Right.
So Daniel has successfully fought off of this Terminus for the time being. But Joe doing a really good job of just exhausting resources. Still needs to find an answer to this Tarmogoyf, but a lot of time, and Daniel just pretty low on raw cards at this point. Daniel takes a draw. It's Liliana of the Veil.
Doesn't have a second black yet, but he does still have a lot of options.
Nope.
Psychological Edge. Just lets Joe know.
This is looming potentially at some point down the line. See if, I assume Daniel here is going to go for Vendilion Click. Another Terminus from Joe.
How did he know?
So in response to the Miracle Trigger, he is attempting to Vendilion Click Joe. Joe is going to Red Elemental Blast the Vendilion Click. Now Terminus is miracled. Tarmogoyf to the bottom.
Vendilion Click in response to the Miracle Trigger is pretty intense.
Yes.
Being able to make it so that Terminus is not the first, is that right? No, it's still the first.
Right, because it still goes to your hand.
Yeah, so is that just to force it through?
Joe passing now with Misdirection and Terminus in hand, both hard castable actually.
And there's Caracas, meeting any Vendilion Click or Venser is a big threat. Of course, the Wasteland, I guess a deterrent to even walking down that path.
And there is Polluted Delta.
We're gonna finally see Liliana come to play.
This is a good spot.
Daniel in pretty good shape now. I mean, we've seen the teeter-totter swing back towards him. He's got Force of Will and a blue card. He's got a Liliana to start getting some advantage. He's even got a Golgari charm to try to, or an Abrupt Decay in case he needs to try to get out of a counterbalance situation.
Joe with still a lot of high impact draws, particularly in Shriek the Angels. But this is a good setup for Daniel. And there's Liliana.
Choosing to keep the Wasteland untapped instead of a blue.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me to see Daniel use the Wasteland here on something after all this resolves.
Oh, yeah. Most likely the Caracas.
It is the most threatening land in play. You can't cut Joe off of any color, so. He says go.
There's another Terminus.
Pluses again. Daniel discards a land. Joe discards misdirection.
This is the one giant area of weakness for misdirection compared to Force of Will. When they drop a Liliana, you do not want that misdirection in your hand.
Joe discards Terminus. Daniel discards a land.
And I think we're going to see Liliana tick up one more, right? I mean, Daniel could just destroy a lot of Joe's land, and maybe that's good enough. But if he waits just one more turn, gets just one more, you know, a little bit greedier, he can actually keep Liliana.
He's doing a quick count here. And Daniel's also drawn a Tarmogoyf this turn, which complicates matters as well.
He does ultimate Liliana.
And I think the large reason that he wants ultimate Liliana is his hand is Force, Blue Card, and Tarmogoyf. If he had one soft piece of the puzzle in his hand, something he could throw away, a land or, you know, a Hindatorak potentially, I think you would see him plus Liliana one more time. But because his hand's so high quality, I think he just wants to do this now.
Seems reasonable.
So
Joe floating blue, 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 red, white, white.
Trying to figure out the division here real quick. How does Daniel want to split these piles?
Now, it's tough because he's going to value that Caracas highly, but he's not going to take in, he doesn't know that Joe has a second Caracas in his hand.
Yeah, and this is you know, we're talking about narrow edges either way, however he splits his pile. The really critical thing in my mind is making sure there's a non-basic land in each pile, because that turns on the wasteland.
Well, the other exciting thing about this one is that if Joe takes the pile of 4, the wasteland would cut off the red mana, but it would also leave Joe without an extra white, with only 1 white mana.
So, Joe attempting to resolve Vendilion Click. Now that the Liliana trigger is resolved. Daniel decides to fight over this and forces. Vendilion Click down.
And we're going to see Tarmogoyf close out the show.
Yep, you see a wasteland on Caracas, and here's Tarmogoyf. So both players had a lot of stuff, and now no one has anything. Except Daniel's got a Goyf.
And it's funny, with as much as just happened, things aren't really that imbalanced. Both players have 3 land. Daniel has a Tarmogoyf. Joe has 1 card in hand. That 1 card is a Caracas. And that's why it's a question of, is this this is a nice modest advantage. It's got Joe on a 3-turn clock, but Daniel had to make the decision of whether or not to get greedy and try to also keep a Liliana.
And again, I think that if he drew a blank that turn instead of Tarmogoyf, he would have done the play that you suggested, but
yep, this way he's just pressing the advantage.
Yep. And there is Venser and Vendilion Click, I believe, that Joe is just seeing through this Divining Top. 2 very appealing creatures to use alongside Caracas. And this is where another subtlety of Joe's list, you don't see this very commonly, but the second Caracas, very likely to come up this game.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, absolutely huge.
Brainstorm here from Daniel.
Daniel experiencing a rush of power as we speak. So many options in his fingers. Now he's just looking for meaningful interaction, right? Like, I mean, obviously, ideally he'd like counterspell type cards, but it's possible this Liliana is a big enough impact, right?
Yeah. Oh, Liliana's great here. It's also a card that doesn't care about Terminus off the top. You know, an additional creature would be fine as well, but you'd ideally like to sort of hedge your bets a little bit here. So Daniel's going to crack his fetch land and presumably cast the Liliana.
Important to note, Joe at 4 life means that this Tarmogoyf is lethal. He's got plenty of answers to it, but that means he's going to be committed to using his interaction to fighting the Tarmogoyf. Liliana is going to have a little bit of free reign.
There's Liliana. Takes it up, both players empty-handed. Passes the turn. Joe spins top. And that Liliana is quite aggravating for Joe, as he was pretty close to being able to set up Venser Caracas with just a little bit more time. And Joe draws and passes.
Oh, Joe's dream here is for Daniel to play his land or play whatever card out of his hand.
Oh, yeah.
And then in response to the
God.
Liliana activation, good play by Daniel.
Yeah, that could have been a disaster.
Good play by Daniel. I think you got to bounce the Tarmogoyf. It'd be nice to be able to bounce the Liliana, block, and then bounce Venser, but then you'll lose your Venser to the Liliana being replayed.
That was a hair breadth away from being.
That was close to disaster.
A disaster for Daniel.
Yep. Smart play, not being greedy there.
All right, Tarmogoyf back. Liliana takes up. Daniel passes back. Joe spins top. Joe trying to figure out a way to stay alive and a way to beat the board. And Joe takes Arid Mace over the Vendilion Click, and I think this is a signal that Joe doesn't feel like the click's high impact. He just needs to look at 3 new cards.
Yeah, I mean, in this spot, Joe's kind of committed to Caracasing the Venser. I think what he wants to do is block the Tarmogoyf, Caracas the Venser, and then be able to recast it and bounce Liliana.
Yeah, and Joe's very quickly to say, all right, I will block. So this is, and I'll return Venser to my hand. Now, Daniel, using Liliana the Veil to plus. In response to this, Joe is going to go ahead and try to resolve Venser again.
Wow, if this is Force of Will, that is devastating for Joe.
And if he's breaking his fetch land right now, I had to assume this is a hard cast Force of Will.
I mean, this would take away most of what Joe has going.
And there it is. Yep.
Very well played. This is a tough spot for Joe now. Now, do you think he's gonna, like, is trying to ride Vendilion Click get him anywhere, or is he under too much pressure because of this Liliana?
I mean, I think he's going to take a look with top because it's somewhat informative now, but I don't think there's anything he can top off the top to actually do anything about this Force of Will.
Yeah, at this spot, he wants to reset. He wants to shuffle his deck, top, see if he can find an Entreat the Angels, and at the very least, just go ahead and make 4 Angels next turn. That would just be, at least that's a plan.
Yes.
A misdirection, but unfortunately, with no blue cards in hand, he cannot actually misdirect the Force of Will.
And now we go to Joe's turn. He draws, spins top again. Trying to figure out if there's some way to shuffle his deck at least. but Joe is up against it. And he has really battled this game too.
Absolutely. Decides to take another look.
All right, top on top, draws a card. Has another top. Uses Scalding Tarn, fresh look at it. Talk about clawing.
What's tough is that by activating top twice there, he's a mana short of being able to top and find his one Supreme Verdict.
But even Swords to Plowshares is still
Oh
totally
yeah,
fine
I mean, there's
spot.
lots of things he could do. Definitely.
I mean, he can always blind top here. If he finds Supreme Verdict, or if he finds Jason the Mind Sculptor, he's right back in it.
No, he's got to take a look because of things like Terminus and.
I agree. I'm just saying.
Oh yeah.
There is some upside for the full greed here, as it does add some outs on the top of your deck. And Joe's not going to look right now.
I don't want to know.
All right, Daniel sends in a Lethal Tarmogoyf. And Joe is going to take a look.
And he no longer has access to double blue, but
Yeah, and
looks like he didn't find anything he needed.
Yep, there's a concession. And we'll be moving on to game number 3. A little under 14 minutes left in the clock.
Pretty wild.
So
that's what Daniel wanted to do.
So what do you think went differently for Daniel in that game? Just the lack of Entreat the Angels? A little bit more action overall?
Well, I mean, the previous game, he actually miracled Terminus several times. Now, he did set it up, but finding Terminus is important to actually, have a little bit of time to set up his game plan. In that spot, we see once Daniel starts hitting you, you're dead in 3 or 4 turns.
Yeah.
If Joe would have had a Terminus, he would have had a lot more breathing room. The second thing that happened was Liliana. Liliana is very effective against this deck and actually surprisingly difficult to remove. So, yeah, I think that's basically the long and the short of it.
Yeah, not a lot of room for this deck to play hard answers to Planeswalkers. He's got to counter it. When decks that play Liliana the Veil also commonly play Abrupt Decay, it's really hard to go to a card like Oblivion Ring or Detention Sphere as an answer.
Yep.
And so you're sort of just priced into either countering it or working around it with things like Vendilion Click and Venser. Not the easiest thing to do, although Joe was only a couple critical draws away from being able to work around not only one, but a second Liliana.
I don't know. I think that these Miracle decks should really consider adopting that new commander card, the X white instant.
Oh sure.
X white instant, if we could possibly pull it up, I'm not sure.
Put a permanent X from the top.
Exactly. Put a non-land permanent X cards from the top of its owner's deck, which in practice is sort of a 3-mana bounce spell that puts the card on top of their deck instead of in their hand, but it has this kicker. Actually, it doesn't even have to cost 3. I mean, it costs 2 mana. It very much is like Boomerang, because you can just pay it for 0 and put the card on top. So for 2 mana, you can bounce any permanent, but to the top of the deck instead of to their hand, other than land, of course, but you can bounce to the top of their deck, and if you have extra mana, you can hide it from them for a while. That's pretty incredible, particularly out of a white card, so.
And if they ever get sloppy with a fetch land, then you just
Oh, yeah.
permanently remove it as well.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah. I think that card's just absolutely, it's really bizarre, the power level that they printed it at, but I think that it's one of those, it's for Commander, it's not going to be in Standard, so we can make the cards, just nutty. There are no rules. Certainly power level and the color pie are a little bit less respected in the Commander products.
Yeah. No, it's great. There's so much focus on True Name Nemesis, but that card and Toxic Deluge, both very high in power level. Toxic Deluge is kind of fringe legacy play, I would say, but I could see an uptick in that card for sure.
Oh yeah, I mean Toxic Deluge is A much better sweeper than black usually gets for 3 mana, outside of Parish style.
All right, both players keep. Joe starts with a Tundra. And a Ponder from Daniel. Looks at Brainstorm, Deathrite Shaman, Tropical Island. He's going to give that one a shuffle.
What do you think about all these legacy cards being printed in Commander products?
I'm a fan. I mean, I understand there's something, you know, annoying slash. I understand the negative feelings about it, but I think that, you know, the biggest threat to Legacy as a format is the format just stagnating, you know, the same decks and the same cards always being good. That's already kind of an issue with Legacy just because, you know, you're not printing better Brainstorms and Hymn to Torak. So as you see Hymn to Torak try to resolve here against Joe, where there's a Brainstorm response. The thing is, you know, it's a way to inject new content to the format without troubling Standard. And it's really hard to do that sort of thing without something like putting them in a Commander product.
What do you think about True Name Nemesis? Was that the right way to push?
Not necessarily, but you know, again, this is a longer conversation. We can have at another point in the broadcast. I suppose, you know, True Name Nemesis is of course a subject of a lot of controversy, and I understand the frustration. But you know, is it the right card to push? No, not necessarily. But I'd rather them push anything at all rather than nothing when it comes to Legacy play. Because I think format stagnation is a bigger systemic risk than how unpalatable any one given card is. So here, Joe fires back with a misdirection on the Hymn, and that is going to resolve.
And we talked about how much better misdirection is than Force of Will against these Hymn to Torak decks.
Joe got punished for it one game when he had misdirection against Liliana instead of Force, but right here is a pretty big upgrade. That Hymn knocks out a Verdant Catacombs and a Brainstorm. Boom.
Now, Joe's got not a ton to work with. He's got some clunky cards until he draws a Brainstorm or casts a Jace. Sitting on, what is that, like Entreat the Angels, Terminus, Venser, all sorts of clunky stuff he can't play yet. But he's not that far away from greatness.
Yeah. Ponder the play from Daniel. And really critical, again, not under any pressure. He has time to set up, uses cantrips, set up his miracles, all of that. Daniel decides that he wants the Delver off the Ponder. Keeps it, now is cracking a fetch land. And finds...
Is he looking for Tropical Island? No,
No.
another Underground Sea.
Yep.
He is not concerned about Wasteland at all, and rightfully so.
So we'll see. Daniel has another Hymn in hand. I'm curious to see if he's willing to go back to the well.
Oh, yeah.
Got to be a little gun shy.
No. See, even if you get your Hymn to Torak misdirected, you're only down one card.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't play your Hymn to Torak at all, you're down a card anyway. And that card was promising to hit 2 cards. You got to just keep doing it.
Yep. I think that play is definitely correct from Daniel, but again, got to have at least a little bit of pause after getting your hand bit last time. See Joe fetching in response here.
Besides, who has 2 misdirections?
Right. What kind of lunatic would have 2 misdirections? What kind of lunatic would have 2 Caracases? What kind of lunatic would have 2 Vensers?
Although I don't know. I've been seeing more and more, like, there was a period of time, what was it, like when Grizzlebrand first came out, where people were just playing 2 Caracases in their blue-black Reanimator decks.
Oh, that was very popular in the sideboard at least.
Oh, yeah. Just did a and it's like, wait, you have 2 Caracases? You're not even going to bounce your own cards. Yeah, it's just to strip mine their Caracas under the old Legend rule, which is, of course, no longer an issue.
Or just get a huge edge to the Reanimator mirror.
Oh, yeah.
So in response to this Hymn, Joe is going to go ahead and play Vendilion Click. Figuring out who he's going to target. I mean, his hand is pretty bad.
Yeah.
All right, but he is going to target Daniel.
If for no other reason than to get the information.
Yeah. Looking at Abrupt Decay, Liliana the Veil, and Delver of Secrets.
And I think we're going to see Joe choose to take the Liliana, possibly even the Abrupt Decay, but most likely the Liliana, just because it could actually cause some problems. Kill the Vendilion Click and leave a problem behind.
Yeah, I don't think that Joe is particularly worried about his Vendilion Click getting Abrupt Decayed, let's say.
Right.
If that click stays in play and attacks, that's great. If not, Joe can set up other game plans. Liliana is a very powerful, proactive game plan for Daniel, and I think it's the most dangerous of the cards.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw what it did last game. Just constricting Joe's options and eventually decimating his mana base.
So we're seeing a pause here, and I believe that I saw our table spotter take a look at the Delver of Secrets in Daniel's hand. Yeah, there might be a problem with Daniel's sleeves.
Because he flipped it around when he drew it in a previous game, but he never flipped it back.
Yeah. And I suspect, because he was playing with checklist cards the earlier game.
Yes.
This might be a serious issue.
Which obviously, an accidental oversight. I mean, he's playing with the checklist cards, just forgot to switch it back, but it's still a very, very serious problem.
Yeah. So we're getting resolution on this momentarily.
For those not familiar, the double face cards, the default way to play with them is with a checklist card, because if you're using sleeves, if you're using no sleeves or sleeves that are not completely opaque, you can tell when you have a double face card being drawn. So use the checklist card instead. If you have completely opaque sleeves, you can just use the card itself. Daniel, not using opaque sleeves, using a checklist, made the replacement in a previous game. However, he never switched his deck back, and as a result, has a marked card.
Potentially, yes.
Potentially, assuming that his sleeves are in fact ruled illegal to be used with a double face card.
Yep. Oddly enough, at an invitational little while back, a couple of years ago in Atlanta, I was playing with some double face cards or two-sided cards rather, in my sideboard of my standard deck. It was Bloodline Keeper. And I went to sideboard, realized that I could tell from the back I didn't have checklists, nor did I have the sleeves, so I basically played with 11 card sideboard for that tournament because I could never bring in my Bloodline Keepers.
Well, after you noticed, why didn't you just go up and buy checklists for 25 cents?
Wasn't feeling it. Refused. Line in the sand.
All right.
Didn't buy new sleeves. Just didn't play with the Bloodline Keepers until a buddy of mine gave me checklist cards to play with sometime during day 2.
All right. I take it you didn't win that one.
I lost playing for top 8.
Once you had the checklist cards in your deck.
Well, actually, I got the checklist cards.
I can assume you went undefeated on day 1, or else you would have changed your strategy in some way.
No, actually, interestingly enough, I got checklist cards and then incorrectly brought in Bloodline Keeper in my winning in and lost with it in my hand that I couldn't cast. So, just the perfect tournament.
Justice. You know, like, sometimes it's hot outside.
Yeah.
Other times, there's just ice everywhere.
Welcome back to the booth, Patrick Sullivan, Patrick Chapin. We're having the judge resolve this situation. Looks to be unfortunate, but we're gonna, keep our fingers crossed that the match can proceed. If not, Joe is gonna pick up the 3rd game on that unfortunate game loss. And we just kind of confirmed it's being upgraded to a game loss. Joe Lossett wins 2-1 for Mark sleeve out of Daniel. Very unfortunate situation, but again, rules are very clear here, and this is a place where I think it's correct to err on the side of